The glass is sweating in your hand. A bead of icy water slides down the curved crystal, catching the strange green glow of liquid that looks almost alive under the cafe's dim lamps. You tilt the spoon, and the sugar cube cracks with a soft crunch before collapsing into the swirl below. The clear liquor clouds instantly, blooming into a pale, milky fog. The sound is small, almost nothing, yet it grips you the way thunder might. Sweetness hisses into bitterness, and the crowd around you hums like a hive. Someone laughs too loudly at a joke no one else heard. Someone else coughs hard into a rag, their hand clenched around it too long before dropping it beneath the table. No one needs to look to know the stain inside is red. The room smells of damp wool coats and smoke, of burnt matches and the faint rot of spilled drink. It is a perfume both inviting and suffocating, clinging to the air until every breath tastes like ashes. Beneath it, the sharp tang of anise cuts through, numbing your tongue before the drink even touches your lips. You press your palm to the table. The wood is tacky, with layers of spilled liquor and careless hands. A coin rolls across the floor, clinking, ignored. Behind you, a woman in a frayed dress stares at her cloudy glass, as if it holds the key to her debts, her children, her hunger. Across the room, a man in a fine hat orders a second round without even glancing at the coins he tosses down. The waiters weave through the room like shadows. Their trays tilt precariously under the weight of glass after glass, their faces locked in the practiced calm of men who have seen too much. You catch the flicker of disdain in their eyes, not for the drink, but for the drinkers who need it. Outside, the carriages rattle along the boulevard, hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones. Inside, time slows. Every drip of water onto sugar feels like a tolling bell. You raise the glass. The green fairy slides across your tongue, cold at first, then burning, then sweet again. A trickster hiding in layers of flavour. Heat floods your chest and spreads outward, loosening your thoughts. The cafe sharpens into fragments. A painter scratches at a sketchbook with trembling fingers. A soldier grips his cane harder than his drink. A poet mumbles lines to no one. Convinced the crowd is listening, you are among them now, tied to their heartbeat, part of their haze. The green fairy promises inspiration. It promises escape, but as your vision blurs, you notice the man beside you shivering violently, his glass slipping from his grip and shattering across the tiles. The shards glitter like fallen stars. No one moves to help. They only watch. You take another sip, and for the first time you wonder, is the green fairy lifting you into brilliance or dragging you into ruin? The story of absinthe does not begin in the smoky cafes of Paris, but in the neat glass jars of an apothecary's shop. In late 18th century Switzerland, doctors and herbalists experimented with wormwood, a bitter plant, long believed to carry healing properties. They steeped it with anise and fennel, producing a tonic that smelled sharp, medicinal, and faintly sweet. It was meant to calm the stomach, drive out fevers, and sharpen the appetite. Few could have guessed that this bitter medicine would become one of Europe's most feared and beloved drinks. Soldiers were among the first to carry it beyond the pharmacy counter. During France's colonial campaigns in North Africa, troops were issued absinthe as both disinfectant and cure-all, meant to ward off fever and kill the taste of brackish water. They returned to France with a habit, pouring absinthe not into canteens, but into glasses at every café that would serve them. By the mid-1800s, the ritual of dripping water over sugar became as familiar as morning bread. For veterans, absinthe was a reminder of the battlefield, both a comfort and a crutch. As the century turned, the drink's appeal spread beyond soldiers and apothecaries. Absinthe crept into Parisian boulevards, appearing in the hands of artists, poets, and the fashionable elite. By 5 o'clock in the evening, the city seemed to pause for what Parisians called l'heure verte, the green hour, when cafes brimmed with men and women gathered around cloudy glasses. It was no longer medicine but spectacle, a performance repeated at countless tables. The drink itself was part of the theatre. The glass, narrow at the base and wide at the rim, caught the lamplight. A slotted spoon balanced across the top, bearing a cube of sugar that dissolved slowly under the drip of cold water. As the liquid swirled into the absinthe, it transformed from crystal green into a cloudy opal haze, a change so dramatic it seemed like alchemy. For those watching, it was as though a simple glass of liquor had turned into a living thing, a fairy summoned from bitterness and sugar. But it was not only ritual that made absinthe spread. Wine, long the staple of France, faced disaster. A tiny insect, the phylloxera louse, devastated vineyards across Europe in the late 19th century, and with barrels scarce, drinkers turned elsewhere. Absinthe was strong, cheap, and plentiful. The more the vines withered, the more the green fairy filled the gap. What began as a cure in a bottle grew into an empire of glasses, spilling across the continent. By the 1882nd, absinthe was no longer a curiosity. It was a culture, a daily habit, and a rising obsession. Soldiers, workers, aristocrats, and dreamers all raised their cloudy drinks together, unaware that the green fairy was already earning a darker reputation. By the 1890s, absinthe had stopped being a drink. It was a spectacle, a ritual, and for many, a way of life. In the cafés of Paris, Montmartre, and the Latin Quarter, the green fairy reigned. 5 o'clock was no longer simply the close of the workday. It was l'heure verte, the green hour, when whole streets shimmered with cloudy glasses lifted in unison. The café was the temple of this culture. Wooden tables sticky with years of spills, chairs worn smooth by restless patrons, and clouds of cigarette smoke that blurred the chandeliers into halos. Waiters in pressed aprons carried trays stacked high with the pale green liquor, their movements quick but indifferent, as though ferrying holy water to a congregation of believers. Outside, the city bustled with the noise of hooves and vendors. Inside, time slowed, absorbed by the drip of cold water through sugar. To some, absinthe was glamorous. Painters and poets leaned into their glasses as if they were communion cups, insisting that inspiration swam within the milky haze. Toulouse-Lautrec painted cabarets while sipping absinthe laced with cognac, a concoction so brutal it earned its own nickname. The Earthquake, Charles Baudelaire, and Paul Verlaine poured their despair into verses fueled by the drink, turning their intoxication into art that scandalized polite society. Their faces grew gaunt, their tempers volatile, yet their words became immortal. For them, the green fairy was muse and tormentor, sharpening visions while blurring the rest of life. The artists were not alone. Musicians played louder, dancers swayed with stranger rhythms, and journalists sharpened their pens in drunken courage. To sip absinthe in these circles was to belong to something daring, something decadent. Patrons believed it freed them from the grey routines of society. A glass was not simply a drink, but a declaration that one lived differently, more intensely, more recklessly. But the glamour had its shadows. Addiction crept easily, unspoken in cafes where genius and ruin sat side by side. The same painter, who found new colours under absinthe's haze, would shiver uncontrollably by nightfall. The same poet who composed furious lines with his glass beside him would be thrown out of cafes for violent outbursts. On the street, ordinary passers-by watched with both fascination and disgust, muttering that these drinkers were touched by madness. The green fairy culture became a contradiction. It was art and decay, glamour and degradation. The cafes sparkled with conversation, yet behind every glass lurked the threat of decline. By the century's turn, what had begun as ritual looked increasingly like obsession, and obsession, Paris was beginning to suspect, had consequences. The glamour of the cafés could not disguise the fact that absinthe was no longer just the drink of poets and painters. By the late 19th century, it had become the daily escape of the working class. And in cramped tenements and smoky taverns, its presence was more desperate than decadent. Factory workers poured their wages into cloudy glasses, seeking a quick numbness after 12 hours bent over machines. Laundresses with raw, cracked hands leaned against counters, sipping the drink that dulled both body and memory. Soldiers who once carried it home from campaigns now drowned their restlessness in it, clutching their glasses with the same grip they once reserved for rifles. The Green Fairy had seeped into every rung of society, but for the poor, its magic was less inspiration and more survival. Absinthe was cheap, far cheaper than good wine. A few coins could buy a glass strong enough to make a man forget his hunger, but cheap relief carried a heavy cost. Families watched wages vanish into taverns, leaving bread uneaten and children underfed. In medical journals, doctors began documenting the effects of what they called absinthism. Their reports described trembling hands, wild hallucinations, sudden seizures, and a wasting of the body that looked like slow poison. The taverns themselves told the story. In corners, men argued violently over debts and dice, their words slurred into rage. Women clutched glasses with white knuckles, their eyes dull from long nights, spent drinking instead of sleeping. The floor was always sticky, the air thick with the mix of alcohol and sweat. The laughter that burst out in the cafés of Montmartre was absent here. In its place were mutters, shouts, and silences too heavy to ignore. The Green Fairy did not ask for loyalty, yet it commanded it all the same. Drinkers returned night after night, their bodies weaker, but their thirst stronger. Priests preached against it from pulpits, blaming it for ruined households and collapsing morals. Police reports filled with crimes committed in drunken frenzy, many pinned on absinthe alone. What separated the bohemian café from the working-class tavern was not the drink but the consequences. The artist could write his madness into verse and sell it to admirers. The laundress had only her body, and absinthe stole that from her piece by piece. The soldier might toast his comrades in memory, but the Green Fairy left him too weak to hold his tools. Absinthe had started as medicine, turned into ritual, and flourished as fashion. Now, it was becoming something darker. For the working class, it was no longer an indulgence, but a chain. By the turn of the century, a new word was whispered in both medical halls and cafés. Absinthism. It was not simply drunkenness, doctors insisted, but a distinct disease. The Green Fairy, they claimed, did not only dull the mind like wine or beer, it warped it. It clawed at nerves, twisted visions, and dragged its faithful into delirium. The reports were vivid. Physicians described patients trembling so violently they could not hold a spoon, their muscles twitching, as if seized by unseen hands. Others spoke of terrifying hallucinations, green spectres rising from shadows, monstrous animals lurking in corners, or sudden visions of death that left drinkers screaming in the streets. The journals warned of memory loss, epilepsy, even madness that could end in suicide or violence. To a public already uneasy, the idea that absinthe carried a madness unique to itself was irresistible. Illustrations in newspapers and pamphlets drove the fear deeper. Artists sketched emaciated figures, hunched over cloudy glasses, their eyes hollow, their hands skeletal. In one famous image, the Green Fairy herself appears not as a delicate muse, but a grinning spectre, hovering over an addict, her wings more bat than angel. To the middle classes who read these papers, the message was clear. Absinthe was not only a drink of the poor or the bohemian, it was a poison spreading through society. Yet, even as doctors thundered warnings, A quieter debate stirred among scientists. Was wormwood truly to blame? The plant contained thujone, a compound accused of causing seizures and hallucinations. But skeptics argued that the amount in absinthe was far too small to cause such effects. They suspected something simpler, and perhaps more damning, the drink's astonishing strength. At 70 to 90% alcohol, absinthe was far more potent than wine or beer. For many addicts, what looked like a unique madness was little more than extreme alcoholism, mixed with poverty, malnutrition, and desperation. But nuance rarely survives in public debate. The myth of absinthe's madness thrived because it was convenient. Wine producers, reeling from the phylloxera plague that had ravaged vineyards, had reason to demonize their strongest rival. Politicians found it easier to point to absinthe than to face the deeper rot of inequality and addiction. Priests used it as a sermon's warning, the devil's drink that led straight to ruin. The truth was tangled. Some drinkers did fall into hallucinations. Some did suffer seizures. Others drank daily for years and lived without such horrors. But the image of absinthism as a unique plague stuck. The Green Fairy was no longer muse or medicine. She was accused of being a monster. If one man has come to embody the shadow of absinthe, it is Vincent van Gogh. His name is inseparable from the swirling yellows of sunflowers, the violent blues of starry skies, and the dark story of a man undone by his own mind. Yet alongside the genius was the drink. Many accounts place the Green Fairy at the centre of his life, whispered as both muse and curse. Van Gogh drank heavily during his years in Paris and Arles, frequenting the same cafés where absinthe had become both fashion and necessity. Friends and witnesses recalled the cloudy glasses he lifted again and again, as though searching for peace at the bottom. He was often restless, quick-tempered, and prone to long nights of furious painting that blurred into mornings of despair. His letters reveal the rhythms of a man both obsessed with colour and tormented by instability. To those around him, the Green Fairy seemed a constant presence at his side. The connection grew sharper with his descent into crisis. The infamous moment when Van Gogh sliced off part of his ear has long been linked, at least in rumour, to absinthe intoxication. Some argued he was driven into madness by the thujone in wormwood, hallucinating and uncontrollable. Others saw it as the collapse of an already fragile mind, worsened by alcohol, but not caused by it. The debate remains unresolved. Scholars tugging between medical evidence, personal testimony, and the weight of myth. What cannot be denied is how the drink seemed to shadow his art. Absinthe's cloudy green inspired his palette. Its reputation for vision echoed in his canvases that pulsed with movement and light. To admirers, Van Gogh's genius was touched by the Green Fairy's wing, granting him a view of the world that ordinary eyes could never see. To critics, it was a sign of poison, proof that his brilliance came not from vision, but from decay. The tragedy deepened in his final years. In the fields of Auvers, painting furiously until the very end, Van Gogh carried with him the weight of illness, poverty, and addiction. When he died in 1890, a bullet wound ending a life of torment, absinthe's role remained an open question. Did the drink feed his demons, or did it simply accompany him while they consumed him? For Europe, the association was powerful. Van Gogh became the face of the Green Fairy's curse, an artist lifted to brilliance only to be dragged into ruin. His story offered a symbol, a warning, and perhaps a convenient scapegoat for a society eager to believe that art and madness flowed from the same cloudy glass. The story that finally pushed absinthe from scandal into outright villainy came not from the cafés of Paris, but from a quiet Swiss village in 1905. Jean Lanfray, a labourer and father, began his day, as many men did, with drink. By evening, his body was flooded with alcohol, a toxic mixture of wine, brandy, and beer. Yet when the newspapers reported what happened next, they pointed their fingers at only 2 small glasses of absinthe. Lanfray returned home from work quarrelsome, his temper soured by drink. Accounts say his wife refused him another glass, and in his rage, he reached for his rifle. By the end of that night, his wife and 2 children lay dead. The horror spread quickly across Switzerland and into France, seizing headlines with grotesque detail. The murders were not described as the act of a desperate alcoholic, but as the curse of the Green Fairy. Doctors testified in court that absinthe alone had poisoned his mind, that 2 glasses had transformed him into a murderer. The case captured the imagination because it fit the fears already seeded in public consciousness. People had heard stories of hallucinations, madness, and sudden violence linked to absinthe. Now, they had proof, or what looked like proof. The image of a father turned butcher under the influence of the drink was too vivid, too terrifying to dismiss. The jury found Lanfray guilty, but the wider trial was not of the man. It was of absinthe itself. In the months that followed, rallies were held across Switzerland. Priests thundered against the devil's drink from pulpits, warning that it destroyed not only the body, but the soul. Women's groups petitioned governments, demanding protection for families from what they called a national plague. Politicians, already swayed by the wine industry's campaign against absinthe, saw opportunity. To outlaw the Green Fairy would be to strike at crime, poverty, and immorality in one decisive blow. The nuance that Lanfray had consumed an ocean of alcohol before the absinthe was lost. Details faded, but the image of those 2 green glasses remained. They became the symbol of a drink blamed for murder, madness, and social collapse. The Lanfray case was not the first time absinthe had been accused of ruin, but it was the moment the accusations turned into action. From that day forward, the Green Fairy was no longer just a scandal whispered in cafés. She was an enemy of the state. After the Lanfray murders, Europe could no longer see absinthe as merely a drink. It became a symbol, a scapegoat, and for many, the embodiment of society's decay. Politicians seized the moment. Priests thundered in sermons, declaring the Green Fairy to be Satan's elixir, a poison that corroded not just the body, but the soul. Newspapers ran lurid sketches of addicts collapsing in taverns or clawing at invisible spectres. Families who lost sons to alcohol or poverty found in absinthe a convenient villain, easier to blame than the grinding weight of inequality. The movement to ban the drink spread quickly, fueled by voices both powerful and desperate. Women's groups rallied for prohibition, arguing that absinthe destroyed households by swallowing men's wages and leaving children hungry. Doctors filled pamphlets with grotesque warnings of seizures, hallucinations, and insanity. Police officials testified to crimes committed in its haze, violent outbursts they claimed no other drink inspired. In courtrooms, defense lawyers began pointing to absinthe as the root of their clients' actions, claiming diminished responsibility. The idea of absinthism, once debated quietly in medical journals, now thundered through the streets. Behind the panic stood another force, the wine industry. Decades earlier, the phylloxera louse had devastated vineyards, leaving France's wine producers in ruins. Absinthe had stepped into the vacuum, cheap, potent, and seductive. By the time vineyards recovered, absinthe's grip was so strong that wine no longer dominated as it once had. To reclaim their market, vintners waged a propaganda war, funding campaigns that painted absinthe as death in a glass. Posters showed skeletal figures, clutching bottles, families shattered under the shadow of green liquid. One infamous cartoon depicted France herself, draped in the tricolour, strangled by the claws of the Green Fairy. The panic became self-perpetuating. Each new report of violence, madness, or despair was tied back to absinthe. Whether the details fit or not no longer mattered. The drink was guilty by association. By the early 1900s, the green fairy was no longer seen as muse or indulgence. She was a public menace, a disease of the people. For the poor, it meant more judgment. A laundress with trembling hands was not seen as a victim of exhaustion or hunger, but as proof of Absinthe's curse. A soldier stumbling through the street was not a man scarred by war, but another casualty of the green plague. The drink became shorthand for decline, an explanation so simple that it ignored the far more complex truths of poverty, addiction, and despair. The stage was set. The Green Fairy's trial in the court of public opinion was nearly over. The verdict would come in the form of bans that swept across Europe. The tide turned swiftly after the Lanfray case. Within a few years, governments across Europe declared war on absinthe, framing it as a public enemy that had to be eradicated for the safety of families and nations. The bans did not arrive all at once, but spread like dominoes, each country echoing the panic of its neighbours. Belgium struck first in 1905, just months after Lanfray's trial, outlawing the production and sale of absinthe. Switzerland, shaken by the murder that had shocked the world, followed with a public referendum in 1908. The vote was decisive. Ordinary citizens, urged on by priests, doctors, and politicians, agreed to drive the Green Fairy out of their homes and taverns. The ban was written into law with almost religious conviction, as though exorcising a demon. France resisted longer, but pressure mounted year by year. By 1915, in the middle of the First World War, the government finally gave in. Soldiers in the trenches were still drinking absinthe, their officers quietly permitting it as a small mercy against mud and terror. Yet on the home front, it was portrayed as treasonous, weakening men, corrupting women, and sapping the nation's strength. The irony was stark. While men fought and died at the front with absinthe in their canteens, lawmakers in Paris outlawed it as an enemy of the Republic. Other countries joined in. The Netherlands, Italy, and the United States all passed restrictions or outright bans. In each case, the language was the same. Absinthe was not merely dangerous, it was uniquely destructive. Governments framed the drink as if it carried a curse that ordinary alcohol did not. Beer and wine remained legal, even encouraged, but absinthe was demonized as poison. The bans changed the rhythm of daily life. The cafés that once glittered with cloudy glasses replaced them with pastis, a similar anise-flavoured drink that contained no wormwood. Wine reclaimed its throne, its producers triumphant after decades of struggle. For many, the bans felt like a moral victory, proof that society could strike down a corrupting influence. But for others, it was hypocrisy. Addiction did not vanish with the Green Fairy's exile. It simply shifted back into wine, brandy, and cheap spirits. The Green Fairy had been banished, but her shadow lingered. Even in Prohibition, absinthe was remembered in whispers, its image tied forever to madness, scandal, and the fall of those who drank too deeply. The bans silenced absinthe glasses across Europe, but the Green Fairy did not vanish. Instead, she drifted into memory, myth, and art. Painters still depicted her pale glow. Poets still invoked her in verses, and the very scandal that had condemned her kept her legend alive. In Paris, cafes no longer served cloudy glasses at the green hour, but the shadow of what had once been lingered in every empty ritual. Absinthe's absence only deepened its mystique. Writers portrayed it as a forbidden muse, a symbol of both brilliance and ruin. To speak of the Green Fairy was to recall Montmartre at its wildest, smoky rooms filled with music, arguments, and sketches scrawled in drunken frenzy. For artists and dreamers, she became a ghost who had never quite left. For moralists, she was a cautionary tale, proof of how easily a society could lose itself in indulgence. Over time, the truth blurred into legend. Was absinthe truly a unique poison, Or had it been the convenient scapegoat of an anxious age? Science leaned toward the latter, showing that the thujone levels were too low to spark hallucinations. The real danger had always been its staggering strength, often nearly twice as potent as other spirits. But facts mattered less than story, and the story had already taken hold. The Green Fairy was remembered not for chemical compounds, but for madness, art, and scandal. The legend lived long enough to inspire revival. In the late 20th century, bans were lifted across Europe and beyond. Distillers began producing absinthe again, carefully regulated, marketed as a lost treasure reborn. Tourists in Paris cafés once more lifted green glasses, repeating the ritual with fascination, though now cushioned by history rather than haunted by panic. The Green Fairy returned, but this time she was tamed, her wings clipped by law and myth. Yet her scandal remained her most enduring legacy. She had been muse and menace, cure and curse, fashion and downfall. Absinthe addicts had once filled medical journals, police reports, and newspaper illustrations, their cloudy glasses blamed for crimes and despair. Today, they are remembered as the faces of a moral panic that swept across nations, a reminder of how quickly fear can reshape culture. The Green Fairy endures not as a drink, but as a symbol, a flicker of glamour, a caution whispered in history's ear, and perhaps, for those who still sip from the cloudy glass, as a lingering question: is she inspiration, or is she ruin? Step back from the smoky cafes, the trembling hands, and the shattered glasses. What remains is not just a story of one drink, but of how a society wrestled with its own fears. Absinthe was never only about wormwood and sugar cubes. It became a canvas on which Europe painted its anxieties about poverty, morality, and decline. The Green Fairy was accused of many things. She was blamed for crime, madness, and the collapse of families. She was said to lure men into violence and women into ruin. Yet beneath the hysteria, the truth was less dramatic and more human. Absinthe was strong, cheap, and seductive, but it was no more magical than the desperation of those who drank it. The scandal that surrounded it revealed how easily facts can be bent by fear, and how profit often hides behind moral outrage. Even so, the legend endured because it held power. A nation could point to absinthe and see an enemy it could defeat. Politicians could claim victory. Wine producers could reclaim their markets. Families could say their loved ones were lost not to the ordinary cruelty of addiction, but to something monstrous and outside themselves. The Green Fairy was myth as much as liquor, a phantom that society created because it was easier than looking in the mirror. Today, absinthe has returned in measured doses, its ban lifted, its mystique polished into tourist rituals. The drink no longer haunts Europe, but the memory lingers. The Green Fairy is remembered in art and story, in Van Gogh's swirling skies, in Lautrec's sketches, in the whispered tales of addicts who sat in cafes until their coins were gone. History rarely remembers wine drinkers or beer drinkers, but it remembers absinthe addicts. Their cloudy glasses became symbols of obsession, scandal, and panic. Their stories remind us how culture can magnify fear until it becomes law, how myth can outlast truth. And perhaps that is the final gift of the Green Fairy. Not her taste, not her burn, but the question she leaves behind. Was she ever truly dangerous? Or was the real danger the stories people told about her?